Labor goes for the coalition on climate as the opposition tries to attack the Prime Minister on negative gearing. The fallout from last night's debate defines the day on the election campaign. I'm Patricia Karvelas, live from the lands of the Ngunnawal people in Canberra. Welcome to Afternoon Briefing. Opposition leader Peter Dutton has clarified that he does believe in climate change following last night's ABC leaders' debate. Mr Dutton last night said he didn't know whether recent natural disasters were the result of climate change because he was not a scientist. But has damage been done to the perception of the coalition on these issues? I'll ask Teal Independent Dr Sophie Scamps. Meanwhile, Treasurer Jim Chalmers confirmed he did ask public servants for advice on negative gearing last year, maintaining the request was different to modelling. During last night's leaders' debate, Dutton and Albanese denied he had asked Treasury officials for modelling on the policy. Will negative gearing rear its head again this campaign? I'll ask my panel a little later. And new research has found, on average, belief in traditional gender roles has been declining across generations, except for Generation Z men, who report more traditional gender norms than millennials and Generation X. What's behind the trend and what might it mean for the election? I'll ask the economist behind the data later this hour. Starting with climate, opposition leader Peter Dutton re-articulated his belief in climate change to reporters today after saying last night in that debate, "I'll let scientists and others pass that judgment."
I believe in climate change, and that is a reality. It's why we've adopted our position in relation to net zero by 2050. And I think if people are concerned and interested in the topic of climate change and want real action, vote for the coalition, because we're the only party through our energy policy which is capable of delivering lower cost electricity and gas, reliable energy.
Also on debate clean-up duty was Treasurer Jim Chalmers, who was pressed again on whether the government had modelled negative gearing changes through Treasury. Now, he stuck to his terminology, which is that he sought a view, and the Prime Minister himself had made no such request.
We respect the Australian Public Service. You know, we know that we rely heavily on the advice that we get there. Whether it comes unsolicited or whether we ask for it, we rely heavily on it. That's as it should be.
So was this unsolicited?
No, I said last year, and I've said on a number of occasions now, that I sought a view.
Also on the campaign trail today, the Prime Minister says it's too early to commit to future pay rises for childcare workers after a Fair Work Commission report recommended big pay rises in these female-dominated industries. It includes a pay rise in childcare of nearly 30%. But Dutton and Albanese would not be drawn on if the federal government would pay for the increase or if it would come at a cost to families.
We need to work these issues through but to be clear, this is not a final determination by the Fair Work Commission. This is something that we've asked them to look at, and the gender pay gap is at historic lows as a result of the work that we have done.
Sorry, if I may actually ask a question. Once you work through that process, though, who will fund those pay rises to close that gender pay gap? Will it be the government?
Well, we're working through the process, and when we work through the process, that's what you do. You work with the Fair Work Commission. We'll continue to do that.
Let's get the latest from both campaigns from our travelling reporters, Tom Crowley, who's with the Peter Dutton campaign, Olivia Casely, who's been with the Prime Minister's camp. Welcome to both of you. And Olivia, first to you. You've just landed from Brisbane, back, I understand, into Sydney. What was the Prime Minister up to today?
Yeah, we just literally just landed now, and we're on the bus racing through the streets of Sydney. So today we were in Brisbane, in Peter Dutton's home turf. A bit of a political tactic, you could say, which is part and parcel of the election campaign. When it comes to the state of Queensland, Labor's challenge there is holding on to the 5 seats it has, but it's also on the offensive too, especially in inner city seats such as Brisbane, Griffith and Ryan, that it wants to claim back from the Greens, who took it off them in 2022. 2022. We were at a childcare centre this morning in Bonner. That's a coalition seat held on a margin of about 3.5%, and it was there that Anthony Albanese was really reflecting on his commitments and developments in childcare. He said yesterday at the ABC Leaders debate that he wants his legacy to be these improvements in childcare, and that was one of his key messages today. He was unwilling to say, though, or to commit to further funding when it comes to increasing the wages of childcare workers, and that's following a Fair Work Commission decision yesterday. After that press conference, we headed to a pub where both the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, and Prime Minister met with some university students who stand to benefit from the government's promise to reduce HECS debts by about 20% if it wins the next election. Ultimately, that part of the doorstop was very curated. A lot of them were Labor members themselves. But as you know, with these kinds of events, when politicians are mingling with the public, you never know what you're going to get. And the Treasurer was chatting with one punter. His name was Eddie, and he said that he'd like to see Jim Chalmers be the next Prime Minister. Fortunately, Anthony Albanese didn't hear that one.
Right, he wasn't in earshot. How convenient. Tom, you're with the opposition leader. Where are you now?
We're in Wyong, PK, with a bit of an Easter theme. Peter Dutton stopped into a chocolate shop to stock up with some gifts for his staff. They'll be going through the Easter weekend, but it'll get a little quieter from here. We've had some sort of farewell messages, I suppose, to this part of the campaign from Peter Dutton, wishing people a happy and a safe Easter, and also telling grandparents that maybe they should use the weekend if they see their grandkids to convince them to vote Liberal, tell them about the cost of living. But it was a press conference in between. We had an announcement at a technical college. That's the thing the Liberals wanted to be talking about today on the skills front. They're bringing back Howard-era technical colleges. They were closed by Rudd, a preference toward TAFE that has been the case since then. They want to bring them back for high schoolers. So it was a bit of an obstacle course for Peter Dutton, who had to saw things, he had to turn things, he had to cut some wires. There was all sorts of stuff going on. But the press conference focused really on policy, following on from last night's debate, a couple of those moments that you played there, and also an interview that Peter Dutton gave that was published in The Australian this morning talking about tax reform, suggesting that he had an aspiration to index tax brackets and get rid of bracket creep once and for all. An aspiration, not a policy commitment. He made the comparison to the Howard government, which worked on these things over time, didn't necessarily front-load them all before the election, but left the door open to pursuing some tax reforms at some point should he form government. So interesting to see where that one goes. Also on the attack over negative gearing, you heard Liv talk about it there. The Coalition keen to talk about that one for sure. Yeah,
that's right. Look, just on climate change, still with you, Tom, there was obviously the fallout over climate change and a stronger or more defined position today from Peter Dutton.
It was a stronger and more defined position. I mean, yesterday, I suppose, in fairness, he did... There were sort of two things that slightly contradicted one another. It was, I accept that climate change is taking place, but then he got into a bit of a knot about, not being willing to say that he trusted climate scientists about natural disasters being linked to climate change. Today he said, look, I do believe in it, but 2 points. It's about what the response should be for a small country in the context of China and India and the emissions that they have, and also talking about a balanced, evidence-based approach as he sees it. He is, keen to keep pointing to frontier economics and others who modelled his energy policy and say that gas and nuclear need to be part of a realistic transition that won't hurt the economy. It's that middle ground he wants to strike.
And Liv, obviously, if you look at all of the published polling, Labor has been making inroads. Is there a sense of positivity as we go into the Easter break where, particularly tomorrow, there won't be a lot of campaigning?
Yeah, absolutely. I've got to say that Anthony Albanese, is exuding a sense of consistency and confidence. Obviously, he has the benefit of incumbency, but as we've been ping-ponging across the country, visiting marginal seats, Labor's message seems to be if you want to find a GP, if you want to get onto the property ladder, then you should re-elect Labor. Its challenge now, though, is convincing both its traditional Labor base, the suburbs, as well as a politically basically blasé that it's done enough and that the economic turbulence that we've seen over the past couple of years is shifting now and improving for the better. The challenge, of course, will be up to May 3. We'll find out then whether they've done enough to win over these voters.
All right. Thank you to both of you and take care. One of the opposition's key criticisms of the government on national security has been their handling of Chinese ships off the Australian coast. This week, the Prime Minister called the Prime Minister called the election. A Chinese state-owned marine research vessel went through the Bass Strait and was quickly labelled a spy ship and became another flashpoint in fears over China mapping submarine cables. Jennifer Parker is an expert associate at the National Security College and worked in the Department of Defence for over 20 years and is our guest this afternoon. Welcome.
Hey PK, thanks for having me on.
Lovely to have you on. So you've written this article casting doubt on most of the claims made about the ship. Do you think it was a beat-up?
So I do think it was a beat-up, and this is the really challenging bit that Australia needs to deal with. We should be concerned about China. We should be concerned about China's maritime aggression in the region, but we need to be considered in the way we react to things. So this marine scientific research vessel, anyone that kind of looked at the course and speed and knows anything about sonars, which is how you map submarine cables, would understand the fact that you can't be mapping submarine cables on the course and speed this ship was going. Now that's getting a little bit technical, but I guess the point is we need to be more considered in our response to what is happening around us, because when we get very upset about things that just aren't feasible, we start to give China some ammunition for their propaganda against us.
Okay, just elaborate on what you mean then. What happens if we're not more considered? How do they weaponise this?
So certainly they can weaponise this in terms of their responses to our ships and aircraft operating in the South China Sea or closer to China. And we do operate up there. Now, we don't send marine scientific research vessels up there because, quite frankly, Australia doesn't own any. That's another issue. But when we send ships and aircraft up there, one of our biggest concerns is the unprofessional and unsafe behaviour that China's military does towards our ships. And there's been a number of incidents. The latest incident was in February where a P-8 was unsafely intercepted. But the problem is, if we carry on and get overly animated about vessels that are just transiting an international strait, which is Bass Strait, or that are, now 900 nautical miles from Perth conducting marine scientific research, well outside of Australia's exclusive economic zone, then they can turn around and say, but you shouldn't be operating anywhere near us. So we just need to be really careful. And we've got to remember that 2/3 of our maritime trade goes through the South China Sea. It's incredibly important for the Australian Navy and Air Force to be able to operate up there.
That's an interesting point. So, you've looked at, as you say, some technical things about the way that this ship was operating. So what was it doing then? What do you think, and why do you think it was legit?
Yeah, so I guess in terms of my background, many years ago I was an anti-submarine warfare officer. So I know a thing or two about sonar and underwater and the water column. This marine scientific research vessel had been working with New Zealand, exploring deep trenches. We're talking 8,000 to 11,000 metres deep. This is not where submarines operate, by the way. It clearly has a project, which it announced in 2020, that is going around the world to explore trenches. And in 2020, when they announced it, they actually said they were going to explore the Diamantina Trench, which is a trench that's about 700 to 900 nautical miles to the west of Perth, which is where that ship currently is. When it left Wellington after the research work with New Zealand and 8 other countries, not just New Zealand, it then transited directly west at about 13 knots. Now, that's the speed of the ship. Sonar, the way you map things along the ground, you can't do that at 13 knots on one speed. You need to go back, you need to overlap, you need to go over your course, you need to slow down. It's just not feasible. The other things that were claimed was that it was conducting signals intelligence. When you look at images of the ship, it certainly doesn't seem to have that capability, but there's also nothing of interest around that area in Australia that it would be collecting on. Now, China does send ships to collect on us, so Talisman Sabre, which is coming up later in the year, massive Department of Defence exercise. Every second year it's been conducted since 2017, China has sent a ship to conduct signals intelligence. It's a different type of ship. So it just made no sense, these arguments. There was a third argument that this ship was mapping submarine routes near our base in HMAS Stirling in WA to prepare for Chinese ballistic missile submarines to operate down here. The closest the vessel got to that was over 200 nautical miles, which is nowhere near that base, right? And the idea that China would put a nuclear-armed submarine through the Indonesian archipelago, which we'd be able to track, to operate off Australia, it just doesn't make a lot of sense. So yes, we should absolutely be concerned about China's actions in the region, but we need to avoid beating these things up.
Right, so we need to be proportionate and, careful and accurate.
Absolutely.
Okay. How about the flotilla that happened earlier? Should we be worried about that?
We should be worried about what that says about China's capabilities, absolutely. So yes, in February through to March, we had 3 ships. We call it flotilla is generally a larger thing. It's 3 ships, but they did circumnavigate Australia. They did that to send a message. That's very clear. There's no reason for them to be circumnavigating Australia. What was that message? 1, how vulnerable Australia is as an island nation. 2, how they can operate in this region. They don't need a port visit. They can sustain themselves. And 3, there was a message to the wider region, right? Yes, we should be concerned about that. Was it a threat to Australia at the time? No.
Well, look, perhaps not actively at that point, but in sending that message, that's quite menacing, isn't it?
Look, China has a global blue water capability, as do we. We deploy other places around the world. Yes, we should be concerned about China's capability, absolutely. I mean, there is a real chance of a conflict in this region. But again, when we talk about proportion, there were claims at the time that they were rehearsing missile strikes on Sydney. To be honest, the intelligence that you collect to do that, you do via satellite. You don't need to send ships down here to do that. We got very excited about the gunnery firing that they did. And you'll remember that 49 aircraft had to divert. They actually did that 340 nautical miles from our coast on the high seas. That is a long way outside Australian waters. And our warships do gunnery firings on the high seas all the time. I've done plenty. Now, yes, we should have been concerned about how close they did it to an airline. That's just bad practice. And we were right to reportage that diplomatically. But again, we kind of got a little bit animated about the direct threat that they posed to Australia when they didn't at the time.
I understand that, but the critique about a Virgin pilot telling us, is that fair? I mean, is that just how it works, that we would wait for a commercial pilot to kind of alert us about something like this?
So again, I think we should be concerned about China, but again, I think we got overly concerned about that. So 340 nautical miles from Australia, they have no obligation to inform Australia whatsoever. And I don't know what the current Department of Defence processes are, but I would hesitate to guess that we wouldn't either 340 nautical miles from another country. It's well outside of our waters, right? Even if you count the exclusive economic zone, which is 200 nautical miles. So when you do a gunnery firing, generally you put yourself 10 nautical miles from an air lane and you'll issue warnings beforehand. Now, whether they issued the appropriate warnings on the emergency airline circuit beforehand, it's hard to say. Maybe they issued them late and the airline pilot heard that, or maybe that's just when the airline pilot got in range of that short-range circuit, right? So I think right to diplomatically have a conversation. If 49 aircraft have to divert, your ship's too close to the airline. But anything more than that, again, is just overreacting. And we need to be careful because there are crises coming. And if we eat up our decision-making capacity with these kind of things, and also, to be honest, the public's interests, then we're setting ourselves up for a failure in the future.
That's a really interesting point. Just finally, recently you've been vocal about this idea of a plan B for AUKUS submarines. Why is that?
So what I'm actually saying is I think AUKUS is on track. Now, AUKUS is complex. There are a lot of moving parts to it. But when you actually look at the risks, whether that be political, financial, whether that be workforce, there is a lot of mitigations in place. So I actually don't think we need to be thinking about a plan B. Of course, within the department, they're going to be doing contingency planning. It's what we pay them tax dollars for. But this whole idea that we should be switching and going to the French and things like that, to be honest, is devoid of the fact that it's kind of on track and it's kind of okay. That doesn't mean it's not risky. It just means that risk is not currently manifesting.
That's such an interesting point. Jennifer, lovely to talk to you.
Thanks so much.
Despite the opposition leader expressing his belief in climate change today, concern lingers among some groups, interest groups who are passionate about this, and some independent MPs over Peter Dutton's comments during the debate last night. Independent MP for MacKellar, Sophie Scamps, joins me now. Sophie, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Patricia.
Now, the opposition leader did kind of send signals that worried some people. Today, he was asked directly about that and he said he believes in climate change. Does that settle the issue?
Look, I think last night was concerning because it did seem like an evasive, slippery answer. I think he was asked very specifically about climate change and how he would act on it. Instead, he tried to fudge it and say, well, he didn't know what the weather was like in a particular place at a particular time. There is a very clear consensus globally about trends, not about weather, about global trends on climate. There is this consensus around global warming over our land, in our oceans, about increased frequency and ferocity of extreme weather events, and that is irrefutable. And I think to not really come out and claim that was really a bit slippery.
Okay, obviously language, matters in a campaign, but he made clear today that he does think that climate change is real. So does it affect your thinking if there was a minority parliament, for instance, and the way that you would approach negotiations with the opposition?
I think we have to be upfront with the Australian people, and so it is really good to hear that he's clarified his thinking on that. People do want our leaders to be straight up when we talk about issues like this. We want a clear and precise answer. So yes, I'm really glad that he's clarified that. What I would like greater clarification on is around the detail of his plan to address climate change as well, and also his energy plan. There hasn't been much talk this election period about the detail on nuclear. I would love to see and hear more of that. If there is a minority government, that's something that I'm going to have to really look at. And as yet, there's a whole lot of different policies that I don't have the detail on to make those decisions.
Well, his answer on his commitment to climate change was that essentially, he had a plan for net zero by 2050. That's why he's committed to nuclear, and that it was a realistic plan for decarbonisation, and that is his commitment to climate change. You don't believe that case?
Look, I think the word is realistic. I think what the Australian people have seen is very little talk about nuclear this election period, so it does bring into question how serious Mr. Dutton is about that nuclear plan. We do need to transition. The whole world is transitioning across the planet. We've got coal-fired power plants which are coming offline. 90% will be offline by 2035. So whether we like it or not, we do have to have an interim plan. The issue with nuclear currently is that it'll take more than 10 years to get up and going. And in the meantime, we need a reliable and cheap source of electricity because our economy depends on that. So we really need clarity about what's going to happen in the next 10 years as well, rather than talking about the 2040s and getting there by 2050. I think that Australians deserve to know very clearly what's going to happen in the next decade.
These issues around climate change were, of course, huge in the success of many Teal MPs like yourself at the last election. If you look at some of the polling around these things, including our own data that we're getting at the ABC here, climate change isn't having the sort of significant voter passion that it was at the last election. So given all of that, do comments like Peter Dutton's in the debate have an impact on how voters are behaving and the way that you're campaigning in your seat?
Well, very clearly, the day-to-day matters like cost of living and housing affordability are absolutely top of mind for people across my electorate and across Australia. And they're the things that we need to be finding solutions to right now. But I've had, having multiple conversations across the electorate, and climate change and care for our environment is there. It's not like it's gone away. It's just that the day-to-day pressures are so important at the same time. But people still want to know that our leaders will be leading and acting to ensure that we have a safe and secure future and that we have a safe supply of energy going forward. So it's not as though those things go away. People absolutely love our beautiful environment here, particularly on the northern beaches. They want to protect it. We don't want seawalls up and down our coastline. We're very low lying. We're surrounded by national park. We've had coastal erosion happening. People want to protect this beautiful area. And so those concerns haven't gone away, but we do need to very much act on cost of living and housing, because housing, we've got so many young families having to move out of the area. We're having great difficulty attracting our key workers, our nurses, our teachers, our fireys. had a construction roundtable. They can't get enough apprentices because they can't afford to live here. So we do need to be acting on multiple issues at the one time, and housing is a huge issue this election.
There's been a big discussion, and in fact I'm about to discuss it with my next guest again, about negative gearing and whether Labor modelled it or not. Labor sought advice but says it doesn't want to pursue negative gearing reform. Do you think there needs to be reform to negative gearing in the next parliament?
Look, I really like the work that Allegra Spender has been doing, along with Ken Henry and many others. She has, for the last 3 years, held roundtables across multiple sectors to hear what they think about the need for tax reform. I think that there's broad agreement that this country does need tax reform. We talk about productivity. Productivity has stalled since 2016 in this country. We've got growing intergenerational inequality, and then we've got these major crises that we're facing with housing and climate. So there's a lot of issues that our tax reform needs to face, and I think we need to do it holistically and do it all at once, not just piecemeal bits here and there. But I'm hearing more and more, I think, that debate around housing. People are genuinely concerned about where their children are going to live. And I had a conversation with a dad this morning. He's got 4 children in their 20s. They're all still at home, and he doesn't think they're going to be able to move out anytime soon or live on the northern beaches. So it's breaking up families and networks, and we're going to have a society where we don't have the key workers that we need living in our suburbs.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. Sophie Scamps, thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much.
International affairs continues to bleed into our domestic political debate, with Russia's relationship with Indonesia a lingering question on the campaign trail. The Prime Minister was scathing of opposition leader Peter Dutton after he apologised in last night's debate, admitting he was wrong when he claimed the Indonesian president had confirmed Russia requested to have a military presence in Papua near Darwin. Now, Anthony Albanese was also critical of Liberal frontbencher James Paterson after he pushed the government to explain what they knew about the potential deal and when.
James Paterson, you know, he's the attack dog for them. He's out there. This is the guy who, the leader of the Liberal Party, stands up and says that the president of Indonesia has made a statement, and then when it's pointed out that that didn't happen, it's just made up, James Paterson comes out and his response is, why didn't Labor know that Peter Dutton was going to pile in on an issue because it was on the internet? I mean, seriously.
Coalition campaign spokesperson James Paterson himself joins me now. Welcome to the program.
As I live and breathe, Patricia, thank you for having me.
Are you an attack dog?
No, my job is to point out the facts and the truth about the Prime Minister and his record, whether it's his failure on the cost of living over the last 3 years, which sees Australians have lost more living standards than any other country in the developed world and worse in our history, or whether it's his weak leadership when it comes to national security and foreign policy, where he so often gets it wrong, confusing Australian Border Force with Australian Defence Force when it was tracking the Chinese research vessel, or claiming that the Australian Defence Force advised him at the same time as the Virgin Australia pilot of the live firing exercises that the Chinese Navy conducted in the Tasman Sea.
I just spoke to Jennifer Parker, who is a well-known expert in these areas, and she has actually done some research to say that there was too much alarmism, particularly about the research vessel and the work that it was doing, that it was inaccurate, and we all have to be more careful because we'll face real crises with China potentially in the future. And so exaggeration or jumping too quickly would be problematic. Do you concede that you need to be more cautious?
Well, I missed her interview, so I don't want to comment on it directly or what she said, but taking from what you said, I think it is important that leaders in government get the details right, and that's why I was concerned when the Prime Minister first said that the Chinese government gave us adequate notice of the live firing exercise in the Tasman Sea. That subsequently turned out not to be true. I was also concerned when he claimed that he heard from the ADF around the same time that he heard from the Virgin Australia pilot that those exercises were being conducted. That subsequently turned out not to be true, and I was concerned when he said said that the Chinese research vessel was being tracked in Australian waters by the Australian Defence Force when in fact it was being tracked by the Australian Border Force. Now let's remember he's the Prime Minister. He chairs the National Security Committee of Cabinet. He has access to our entire intelligence and military apparatus at his fingertips. He's regularly briefed to a high level of classification on sensitive national security issues, and he can't get the details right. And I think that is a concern for Australians.
OK, but just this week you've had two pretty high-profile moments. Peter Dutton over the Indonesian president, whether he knew of a request in relation to Russia, and also Bridget McKenzie on this program yesterday in relation to comments about China and Russia. Is the same obligation should you be held to the same obligation in relation to details?
Well, one thing that will be helpful with those details is if the government abided by the caretaker conventions and provided us with the briefings that we've requested that we are entitled to. When there are significant foreign policy or national security developments in an election campaign, the caretaker conventions dictate that briefings be provided to the opposition, because it is important that we have an equal understanding to the government of the challenges Australia faces, because this election could go either way and we may soon have to be making big decisions in the national interest.
But to my substantive question,
so it's
which
not
was,
adequate.
Is there an obligation on the opposition? I understand your critique of the government, but is there also an obligation on your side to be more careful and accurate?
Well, I think this is a really substantive issue, Patricia, because 48 hours since we made this request, it has not been granted. And I would be very grateful if the government would abide by the caretaking conventions and provide those briefings so the opposition has an equal picture about what's going on here. OK, but I am going to ask third time. I know you want the briefing, and you've made that point, and I think it's a fair enough point. But to the question of whether there should be a higher obligation on you as well, you want to form government, do you agree, yes or no? Well, of course, there is an obligation on all of us to get the facts right and to be informed of the facts, none more so than the Prime Minister. We certainly won't be taking his advice on getting the facts right on national security, given the examples I just gave you, where he has got it wrong himself as the Prime Minister, who has the benefit of the access to all those briefings and all that intelligence.
So you're saying maybe you would have got more details right if you were getting more briefings? Is that what you're suggesting?
Well, in an election campaign, politicians are throwing questions all the time. We have to respond to breaking news events that are often incomplete pictures, and voters expect us to respond in a timely way to those questions. And that's what happened. Occasionally people misspeak. It's not unknown of in government or opposition, as I've pointed out to you. But one thing that would be helpful, and I think in the national interest, is to make sure that we have access to those briefings so we have an equal opportunity to be informed about things that are being developed. I mean, the Prime Minister has skirted around this today, but it is still not clear to me whether he believes this offer was made or this request was made from Russia to Indonesia. He's implied perhaps it wasn't. Well, if that is the case, we should know that, because the military publication, Janes, which published this, is a very respected publication. They put out a statement standing by their story today. The Russian government has put out a statement which doesn't directly say, but certainly implies that this conversation has happened with Indonesia. And of course, the Russian Defence Minister, in the middle of their largest war since the end of World War II, travelled to Jakarta in February for discussions with the Indonesian government. So if no offer was being made or no request was made, then that's certainly interesting, but we would like to establish those facts, and a briefing would assist us to do so.
If you were to win the election, how would you influence the Indonesians to stop them? Or, you know, I know you suggested yesterday you'd like to stop them having military aeroplanes come through Indonesia from Russia. How would you do that? I mean, they're a sovereign nation. They can make their own decisions. How do you influence that?
You're absolutely right, Patricia. They're a sovereign nation and we respect their sovereignty, and we deal with them as an equal partner. And the relationship between Australia and Indonesia on national security is very wide and very deep. We cooperate on people smuggling, on anti-narcotics trafficking, on counter-terrorism and a range of other areas. And as part of that deep and broad relationship, there is give and take. We understand what's important to Indonesia's national interest, and we make accommodations for their national interest, and they understand what's important to our national interest, and they make accommodations to our national interest. That's part of a mature bilateral relationship from partners in the region who don't always share an exact same perspective, but have that shared interest of making this neighbourhood safe for all of us. And so we'd maturely engage with Indonesia and explain to them why it is important for us that there are no Russian aircraft access in our region, and why that would be very detrimental to our national security interests.
Malcolm Turnbull has tweeted saying that negative gearing is examined by every government and was examined by his government. He says that Peter Dutton was indeed a senior cabinet minister. So in the points that you've been trying to make today, the opposition's been raising questions about the Labor Party looking at those options. Didn't it also happen when there was a coalition government?
Well, I'm not asking for the Prime Minister not to consider negative gearing. If that's what he wants to do, he's welcome to do that. What I'm asking is the Prime Minister be honest about it, and he clearly wasn't honest about it in the debate last night, Patricia. He said that his government did not seek any advice from Treasury on this issue. His own Treasurer, standing next to him today, had to admit, in fact, they did seek advice on this. When a smooth talker like Jim Chalmers can't even find a way to extricate the Prime Minister from his lie, I think that speaks volumes. The Prime Minister should just be upfront and honest about this, because he has lied about tax before. Before the last election, he said they'd make no changes to stage 3 tax cuts. They did. Before the last election, he said they'd make no changes to superannuation taxation. They've sought to in this parliament. And so Australians are entitled to question his motives when he lies about seeking advice from the Treasury about negative gearing and capital gains tax discounts.
So I just want to clarify that first bit of the answer, if I can, which is you think, it's fair enough governments can look at negative gearing. Yours did, Labor did. No one's actually pursuing it, it seems, though.
Well, we're certainly not. We believe that negative gearing is a perfectly acceptable part of the tax system. We think it's a way to ensure that there are adequate rental properties provided to the market. We think it's a way for aspirational people to build wealth. So we support negative gearing. But we also want to give a leg up to first-time buyers.
I get that, but do you support the idea that, governments ask for different advice, just like the Turnbull government did?
Yes, governments seek advice, and when they do so, they should be honest about it, and the Prime Minister hasn't been. He's been contradicted by his own Treasurer on the question of whether or not they sought negative gearing advice. And the question we're entitled to ask is, given that he wants to lie about that, given that he wants to hide it, what is his motivation? Why is he doing it? Is it the same reason that he lied before the last election about superannuation taxation? Is it the same reason that he lied before the last election about stage 3 tax cuts? Is he trying to obscure a secret agenda from the Australian people to in fact make changes on negative gearing or capital gains tax discounts? We know there are many Labor backbenchers who supported it. When the Treasurer was flirting with it last year, a number of Labor backbenchers went public and said that'd be a good idea and we should do that.
I know people on your side of politics that support changing negative gearing.
Well, if they do, they're very welcome to say that. I haven't heard them say that. We're not taking that policy to this election, and we won't make any changes to negative gearing because we support the principle that you should be able to deduct the losses against your rental income. We think that's an important principle in the tax system.
Okay, final question. Peter Dutton said last night that the water issue for your nuclear plant is resolved, that you've included it in your modelling. But one of your own MPs, Darren Chester, says experts will first need to determine facts, not opinions. Is Darren Chester wrong?
Well, I haven't seen the full context of Darren's comments. I'm not sure when that interview took place. I'll have to go and look at that, Patricia. But we are very confident about our nuclear plan. We've done extraordinary level of work on the 7 potential nuclear sites, the host communities that would have it, which of course, as you know, are on the sites of retiring coal-fired power stations, where we have the benefit of access to water already because they rely on it, where we also have the benefit of access to transmission lines and a workforce which has highly transferable skills, and communities which are energy mature and understand how a sophisticated modern energy system can work, and understand that of the 20 G20 countries in the world...
Is Darren Chester wrong that there's going to be a process?
I can't contradict Darren because I don't know what it is you've said. You've just put a very small quote of this to me.
There's going to be a process to work out the water needs, whereas Peter Dutton thinks it's settled. Which one is it?
Well, forgive me, Patricia, I'm not going to rely on just a partial quote from you of an interview of my colleague that I haven't seen. I don't know the full context of what he said, but I am very confident that we've done the careful, methodical, considered work, and that nuclear power is a proven technology. This is not a new technology. It's not like the Prime Minister's plan to rely on green hydrogen, which is totally speculative. This is a technology which has been used around the world very successfully in the world's largest and most developed economies, where governments of the centre-left and the centre-right in the European Union, in the UK, in North America, use this technology successfully to bring down emissions and provide reliable baseload affordable power.
Looking forward to a little Easter break, or aren't you getting one?
Well, look, there'll be a bit of a cessation of campaigning hostilities for Good Friday and for Easter Sunday, and I think that'll be a time for a little bit of downing on the tools, but otherwise it's normal campaign routine for us.
Okay, all right. Well, I hope you have a good little break, even if you get one. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Patricia.
In the lead up to our federal election, there has been discussion over whether there will be a gender divide in voting patterns, like there was in the US election last year. Already there's lots of evidence that men and women are skewing in different directions. Men more to the right, women more to the left. Now, new research out today from the E61 Institute has found another divergence, that Generation Z men have more traditional beliefs than both millennials and Generation X men. Erin Clark is the economist behind the research. I spoke to her a little earlier. Erin, welcome to the program.
Hi, Patricia. Thanks for having me.
First of all, describe the pattern you found among young men. How did you measure what constituted what you described as traditional gender roles?
Yeah, so in this research, we used data from the Household Income and Labour Dynamics in Australia survey, or otherwise known as the HILDA survey, which is a yearly survey that follows the same individuals since 2001. And within that survey, every 4 years, there are some questions asked that can give us an idea about somebody's beliefs in traditional gender roles. So these questions include things such as, it's better for everyone involved if the man works and the woman stays home and takes care of children, as well as, on the whole, men make better political leaders than women do. And so what we've done is we've created a measure using 7 of these questions to try and understand how individuals, how they sit in terms of whether they have more traditional views about gender roles or more progressive views. And so what we've found for young men is, there's been a gradual shift away from traditional gender roles across generations over the last 20 years. However, Gen Z men seem to be an exception to this trend. And so we see that they actually hold more traditional views about gender norms than millennial men and Gen X men, and much more traditional views as well than women in the same age group.
That's fascinating, and it sounds almost counter to what you'd expect. There is an assumption that kind of generational change will change that. So just talk to me about that generation. What is that age group for those that don't remember all the generations off the top of their heads, and what was the difference you saw?
So Gen Z is anyone born from 1997 to I think 2013. They are aged around sort of 20, like average age around 23 or so. We also did the same, we looked at the same analysis by age group, and we see the same thing for young men aged 15 to 24. And they have overtaken, men in all age groups other than men aged 65 and over, which was a really striking finding.
Does it change depending on whether they live in the sort of metro regions or whether they live in the regions?
Yeah, so this is another sort of really interesting thing that came out of the work. So we have tried to look and see if this trend holds when we account for things like, whether you live in the city or a regional area. We also account for whether people are employed or not, as well as whether they are partnered. And when you take all of these things into account, while they do explain some of the trend that we see, there's still a large portion of it that is unexplained by the data or unexplained by those demographic factors. And so there must be something else going on underneath it all that we're hoping to dig into.
And you also found that Gen Z's men's views started changing at a particular point in time. What were the differences? Like, when did that happen?
Yeah, so we see that particularly after 2018, there is this, that's when they start to diverge from, men in other age groups and generations. So, yeah, there's something going on around that time.
There's obviously more research that's needed, and that's really important that we always say that, and we very much stick to the facts. But looking at this trend, what sort of explanations do you think there could be for especially that time frame that you talk about, 2018?
Yeah, so there is no single explanation, and as you said, at the moment, the research that I've done can't point to that. It's definitely something, exploring the drivers behind this is definitely something that we're looking to do in the future. Experts suggest that differences in the type of social media that young men are consuming compared to young women could be a factor. Others highlight, the possibility of backlash to changing gender roles, and also shifting economic opportunities for young men could be playing into this as well. But yeah, for now, our analysis can't speak to any of these hypotheses, but it's definitely something that we're keen to dig into.
What do you think this might be doing to voting patterns? We are in an election now where Generation Z and, of course, millennials are going to be the biggest voting bloc together. Obviously, they're two different generations, but that means younger people. What might it actually mean?
Yeah, so whether traditional attitudes towards gender roles directly map to, voting preferences is unclear, because political ideology is not just about gender norms. People's views on gender roles will play a factor into how they vote, but young people's views on the economy, the climate, and other factors will also play into their decision on who to vote for. But what this research does point to is that young people are not a uniform group, they're not a monolith, and gender matters. So understanding the different preferences of young men and young women is key to understanding this voting bloc.
Really interesting stuff. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Patricia.
Well, it's not Friday, but our program and some of the politicians themselves will be taking a short campaign break over Easter starting tomorrow. So we're going to wrap the campaign week now with Anthony Galloway from Capital Brief and Mark Kenny from ANU and the host of Democracy Sausage podcast. Welcome to both of you.
Thanks, Patricia.
So we're officially, tomorrow morning at the end of week 3. So past the halfway mark. What's happening? Mark.
What's happening?
Who's ahead?
Well, all of the data that we have, that is the sort of public polls and the trend in the public polls, suggests that Anthony Albanese went into this campaign, or at least into the lead up to the campaign, not in a particularly strong position. I think some people were sort of talking about a Labor recovery through most of this year, but it was kind of pale and you didn't want to hang too much on it. It seems to have, I think, accelerated a bit. That seems to be the consensus among the polls. If you look at the body language of the two campaigns and of the two leaders and of the attitudes of the people in those sides, there's a sense that Labor is ahead. But I think this is a really hard one to pick, because more and more with each election we're seeing a bigger element of the campaign happening at that subterranean level in a whole range of different ways. But with some of the people as you were just talking to in that previous interview, the different ways of people getting their information, micro messaging, Instagram and TikTok and these sorts of things being used to parcel up messages. That's the way a lot of people, for example, will have got that debate last night, or will be getting it over the subsequent days.
Moments on their phones.
That's right. They'll be getting curated versions that are either pro one side or the other, or attack ads. They won't have sat through the whole thing.
That's a really good point about the debate, which is why none of them want to have a disastrous moment, right? Because that will be amplified by the other side.
Yeah, totally. We forget that with the debates, the aim is just to come out with not creating kind of that really awkward moment. So for Dutton last night, it was admitting a mistake, which I can't understand why you wouldn't do that at the press conference. He made the mistake on Tuesday. He could have clarified that later Tuesday or the press conference yesterday.
Well, for our viewers, they will know, especially those that join me every day, and I love you all, they will know what happened. So Peter Dutton comes on this show and really goes a little further than he had in his press conference in relation to this request. Just walk us through it.
Yeah, well, he verbals the Indonesian president when it was really sources to a respected defence publication, Jane's US-based publication. So, I mean, it wasn't the worst mistake in the world. He could have just quickly clarified that day that I was referring to sources close to the Indonesian president rather than the fact that the Indonesian president had confirmed this Russian request to establish an Air Force base in Indonesia. So it wasn't the worst mistake. It was the fact he waited more than 24 hours and then admitting he made the mistake on debate. That's where you create that kind of issue. So
yeah, he did clarify in the debate that he got that wrong, but it did take a while.
Well, yeah, and I think that to some extent is the power of David Spears, frankly. I mean, I think that there was a sense from both leaders that they were dealing with someone with real authority in that debate. I'm not saying there aren't other people who have that as well, but it was a really superbly run debate, I think, and you could see that people went into it knowing I can't get away with being too woolly here, too sort of fast and loose with details, because if my opponent doesn't pick me up, the moderator will pick me up. He's known for that.
Yeah,
it's the double pickup.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think that, but I just make one other point, and I think this is about Dutton getting into this problem, is that there was a degree of desperation, as there always is in election campaigns, looking for that thing that's going to give you the edge, particularly if you perceive yourself to be behind. And there was this schadenfreude, and you could see it right through a lot of the other comments, this sense that you did this to us during the last election campaign when when there was this sort of Solomon Islands issue that came up, right? And you played that really hard and extracted a pound of flesh. We're coming for it now. And the trouble is they didn't have the details correct, and he overcooked it. And then the question is, and I think this came up on your panel last night as well, why the hell would you not just clean it up more quickly? I do think it still might have come up in the debate anyway, but the fact that he sort of left it right until then, sort of let some steam build up behind it and then said, all right, okay, I admit that I was wrong.
Yeah, it says to me there's some disconnect between the travelling party, those following Dutton, and Campaign HQ. Like, is he accountable to Andrew Hurst, the Liberal Party federal director, in the same way that Albanese seems very accountable at the moment to Paul Erickson and Labor HQ? I just question that, whether there's a bit of a disconnect there, given the amount of times they're taking to kind of clean up things, where Labor's just seems to be right on it immediately, in a way that Albanese has not been right on cleaning up things for the entire period of his government. He's taken sometimes weeks to kind of address a crisis.
He certainly has, actually. So, that kind of what I consider inept behaviour, where you kind of allow something to build up rather than being able to fix it and then reset, has been a feature. But it's got certainly better, hasn't it? Like the Labor operation.
Yeah, I think the campaign's tighter. Labor learnt in the last campaign what Peter Dutton is learning in this campaign, and what I guess we learn every time, which is that first-time opposition leaders going through an election cycle really struggle with this sudden acceleration in the pace and scrutiny that comes with it, and all of the things that you need to be across. That's the first thing. The second thing is, I think, when you're in government, you've got better resources, you've got more planning, you've been through the cycle before, you can sort of control things to a degree. And so, yes, it looks like the shoe is on the other foot now. Let's face it, Albanese's first campaign in 2022 began very poorly.
Oh, absolutely.
And there was a number of missteps. I mean, there's been literally a misstep in this one off the back of a stage.
Well, let's go to that, because again in the press conference I heard Peter Dutton, I'm sure you piqued your interest too, saying he, what I can promise, something around the words, even if I fall off a stage, I won't lie about it.
Yeah, this is being picked up, I think, in Liberal focus groups a bit, where just the Prime Minister's evasiveness, and I mean, yeah, it was most stark after he clearly fell off a stage and said he didn't fall off it. And last night you saw it with that question of seeking advice from Treasury, which Jim Chalmers' office did do. They asked Treasury to conduct...
have a little look at this negative gearing issue, please.
Yes, yeah. and the capital gains tax discount. And there's nothing wrong with asking Treasury to look into something and then deciding not to go ahead with it.
James Paterson just said nothing wrong with asking.
Yeah, exactly. But Albanese says, no, my government didn't last night. And now he tries to explain that by saying, well, it was we asked for advice, we didn't ask for modelling. It's like, come on.
It's a bit tricky, right?
Yeah, and I think that's maybe being picked up a bit. That's why Dutton, especially today, the last 24 hours, he's going so hard on the word liar, which is, really hard.
He is, because, and that must be, you would assume, based on research that's building.
We're at the stage of the campaign where just about everything that happens you can sort of tie back with a reasonable level of confidence to something they're picking up in their tracking, polling, and in their other focus group research that they're doing. So I think that this, there's such a start. It doesn't matter that he fell off the stage, right? That could happen to anyone.
Well, it's actually bad luck, and it's lucky he didn't break something. It's actually not a very nice thing to happen to someone.
That's right. I mean, before you go on stage, people say break a leg, and he nearly did, right? But luckily he didn't. But then he came and said that he didn't. And the issue itself doesn't matter, but there's a contrast between the image that you see and that denial. I mean, look, we've all fallen over at some stage. The worst thing's when you fall upstairs, you're sort of sudden. Oh. But whatever happens is you often jump up really quickly and pretend it didn't happen.
You're exaggerated in your emotions. It's all good. Don't worry about me.
But the trouble is when you're in a campaign and you're the key person, you're the VIP, and suddenly you disappear off the back of the stage, it's kind of an event.
Yeah, it certainly is. I suspect part of what he was doing was just he was embarrassed in that radio interview, don't you reckon?
I think so, yeah.
But either way, it was the wrong call.
It was the wrong call. Like, given that he didn't actually fall on his bum, that was his rationale.
Right.
As I understand
that it wasn't the full collapse.
Yes, exactly. As I understand it, which you've just got to own it, right?
You do, and it was a pretty bad piece of design of that stage. I mean, you had to walk around behind some people.
I thought there was going to be a Labor Party Royal Commission into that stage, actually.
And I don't think that probably didn't matter. I mean, the Liberals tried to make a big deal of it at the time, rolling out videos and the like. That probably didn't matter until something like the negative gearing moment, and then it allows Dutton to probably...
These things happen in campaigns. I remember years and years ago watching Bob Dole. That's how long ago it was, when he was the US presidential candidate, and they had little sort of Roman column sort of balustrade at the front of the stage, and he leaned over down to where the people were, which was lower than the stage, to shake someone's hands, and the fence just gave way, and he ended up crowd surfing. This guy's about sort of 74 at this
just made me laugh. I don't want to laugh at people falling, although it's very easy. Look, so yes, Anthony Albanese had the difficulty over negative gearing, but Peter Dutton had some difficulty over climate change. Again, the same pattern. He was asked whether he thought natural disasters were being accelerated by climate change, which is a really easy yes, I thought. Yeah. But he kind of was a bit... He couldn't say yes.
Yeah, you can see what he's saying, that you can't tie necessarily one event to... But
that wasn't the question.
It wasn't the question, and he could have just answered that yes, the expert
But today he says he believes in climate change.
Yes. I think he was just... It is typical of Dutton on this policy area. He's not actually that pragmatic, despite he is very pragmatic on climate and energy. I mean, the whole nuclear policy is really about solving how do you remain committed to net zero, and satisfy the Nats and a handful of people in the Liberal Party room, and nuclear kind of solves that. So I think
if you believe it,
well, that's right. So they both had tricky moments out of that debate. They've got one debate left.
Can I just stay with it just for a sec? That point about sort of saying that. I don't have a judgment on it, but we'll take some advice from the scientists. I'm thinking, how long have we been talking about this? We have actually taken some advice from science. There is a giant global consensus on this issue that has existed for decades.
Yeah.
The idea of sort of it's still being a hung jury on this question is bizarre.
It's like he's talking to everyone in the coalition party room when he talks about climate change.
Yeah.
Well, I did wonder about that, because that is an issue. There is increasing pressure among right-wing voters and whether they might go to other options. Is that part of perhaps what's going on here?
Well, perhaps it is. I mean, the whole nuclear thing, when you think about it, it strikes me that one of the things Dutton's done really well is he's delivered in one term a coalition that's quite competitive, that's been unified all the way through. But he's purchased that unity by not moving mediocre people on the front bench, by keeping his team the same, and by essentially not having any policy fights, any deep arguments over things, any deep examination of things. And the one thing they've come up with, which is really big, but it's way over the horizon, is nuclear, which has been something the Nats have loved for years. And so there's already been this sort of a capitulation to this populist right, this idea that we get past all these renewables and all these inner urban types that are going on about it and go straight to something we know they hate and which they can't argue against because it's carbon neutral and away you go. And so there's some pretty strange politics being played here.
You've touched on an interesting point there. I think if Labor end up with a majority or an even bigger majority, I think that'll be a major talking point coming out of it, because Dutton put such a premium on unity, but if it doesn't, if Labor doesn't go into minority, I think the talking point within the coalition will be perhaps we should have had the big fights.
Perhaps we should have done some stuff, because we rolled up at this election campaign with largely an empty cupboard, if largely an empty cupboard isn't a contradiction in terms.
Yeah, well, I often think have your fights early rather than having them at the wrong time. I mean, they're a bit more unified now, but there was a couple of wobbly period a couple of weeks ago. You've been great at helping me understand the week. Thank you.
Thank you.
And that's it for Afternoon Briefing for today. We'll be back on your TV on Monday. We're taking Easter Friday, Good Friday off. Stay with us here on ABC News. Joe O'Brien is up next with today's top stories. We're, of course, on iView. I hope you have a terrific Easter break. Catch you later.